Financial disasters do not occur spontaneously. They are meticulously constructed over years, drafted in legislative blueprints and hidden within ledger entries, long before the first margin call is ever issued. In the 1840s, the British economy experienced a sequence of severe shocks. A massive speculative boom in railway construction collapsed, and almost immediately after, a severe commercial crisis swept through the money markets in 1847. It is tempting to look back at this period and diagnose a simple psychological phenomenon. Naive retail investors swept up in irrational exuberance, blindly buying into a bubble until reality set in. The data shows a different reality. The collapse was a lethal confluence of three distinct structural failures: the widespread use of derivative-like leverage, systemic corporate accounting fraud, and rigid central bank legislation. Examining the specific mechanical failures of the 1840s reveals the structural vulnerabilities that characterize modern liquidity and leverage crises. The asset classes change, but the underlying physics of collapse remains identical. In the mid-1840s, expanding the British railway system required massive capital outlays. Hundreds of new companies were formed, projecting thousands of miles of new track. To finance this expansion, the industry relied on a specific financial instrument, the partially paid share. Unless investors did not buy full equity in these new companies outright. Instead, they placed a small initial deposit, typically 10% of the share's total par value, to obtain the asset. This 10% deposit functioned as a highly leveraged derivative. An investor commanded massive nominal equity while holding a 90% liability. Any increase in share price generated outsized, amplified returns on their initial cash deposit, fueling an illusion of limitless market capital. Investors exhibited myopic rationality. They accurately priced in short-term dividend forecasts, but completely ignored the massive looming capital requirements of actually building out the physical railway infrastructure across the nation. The structural trigger arrived when the railway companies began laying track. They needed actual cash to pay builders and suppliers, so they issued calls, lethal demands for shareholders to pay the remaining 90% of their capital. This created a devastating mechanical feedback loop. To generate cash to meet capital calls on new shares, investors liquidated their existing shares. This mass simultaneous liquidation placed a continuous crushing downward pressure on the entire market, forcing further sell-offs. The market crash was the mathematical outcome of the leverage structure. When the system demanded cash that investors did not have, the collapse became an engineering reality. The leverage in the markets was compounded by opacity in corporate boardrooms. George Hudson, the railway king, aggressively amalgamated small lines. By 1849, he controlled nearly 30% of the British railway network. Hudson's physical empire was vast, but his financial empire was built on deliberate accounting fraud. Hudson paid exorbitant dividends directly out of raised investor capital, completely bypassing actual operational revenue. This accounting illusion masked the true, punishing costs of railway depreciation. The actual revenue was entirely insufficient to cover ongoing track maintenance. By paying earlier investors with the capital of newer ones, this practice transformed the most prominent British railway companies into effective Ponzi structures. When the initial speculative boom ended and new capital inflows ceased, Hudson's system collapsed. Without fresh investor cash, the total inability to pay dividends out of non-existent operational revenue was exposed. Unchecked accounting opacity allows executives to turn physical infrastructure booms into fragile financial illusions. The ledger was rotten long before share prices began falling. As the railway market deteriorated, the broader macroeconomic environment of late 1846 and 1847 was hit by two exogenous shocks. First, the corn market experienced a sharp price reversal. Prices rose rapidly and then suddenly crashed, leading to the failure of highly leveraged grain merchants and the bill brokers who held their paper. Second, the onset of the Great Famine in Ireland, driven by the failure of the potato crop, demanded massive emergency interventions from the British state. Massive emergency grain imports from the United States were required. these imports had to be paid for in physical gold, rapidly draining Britain's bullion reserves. This physical drain of gold collided with a complex variable, the Bank Charter Act of 1844. The act intended to make paper currency function exactly like metallic currency by placing a strict cap on unbacked notes the central bank could issue. The legislation contained a fatal rigidity during this specific crisis. As gold drained to the US, the Bank of England was legally mandated to shrink the money supply and severely restrict domestic credit. This dynamic paralyzed the Bank of England, exactly at the moment the broader market desperately needed a lender of last resort to provide liquidity. The central bank's hands were legally tied. This text details the Bank of England's discount rate. After the usury laws were repealed in 1833, violent spikes in the bank rate during the crisis proved the severity of the credit freeze, as the central bank rationed its depleting reserves. By October 1847, the elements converged into a panic. Railway capital calls were peaking, corn merchants were defaulting, and the central bank was paralyzed. Macroprudential regulations designed to eliminate crises can paradoxically engineer catastrophic liquidity traps by stripping the monetary system of all elasticity when it needs it most. The immediate crisis was only resolved through direct political intervention. In late October, Prime Minister Lord John Russell and his Chancellor of the Exchequer issued a letter to the Bank of England. The letter officially indemnified the bank. It granted them explicit permission to illegally breach the limits of the 1844 Act and issue unbacked notes to provide liquidity to the markets. The psychological effect was instantaneous. The mere market knowledge that liquidity was finally available ended the panic immediately, without the bank even needing to actually issue the unbacked notes. The long-term structural legacy took longer to materialize. Following the ruin of George Hudson's empire, the House of Lords established the Montagle Committee to investigate the disaster of railway accounts. This shifted standards of corporate accountability. The practice of auditing books through amateur shareholders was abandoned, replaced by independent professionals and quantitative analysts like William Deloitte and Robert Lucas Nash. The crisis forced a change in how the life cycle of industrial assets was understood. The market realized that physical infrastructure inevitably breaks down, prompting the formal adoption of systematic depreciation accounting. The railway mania faded into the Victorian past, but the interactions between leverage, accounting opacity, and central bank rigidity continue to provide the framework for contemporary financial instability.